Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, we're all good. Great, thank you. Danielle promised to tell some jokes about me, and I was hoping for that, so perhaps later. No, it's really a blessing to be here today. I appreciate the fact that you've given up some of your valuable time to come out here. As a person that works constantly, showing up to a talk is not always the top of my priority list. So I certainly understand the sacrifices that you've made to be here, and I certainly appreciate it. Being an academic is like the best job in the world, We get to hang around smart people, we get to debate important topics, we get to write and read a lot, we get paid, to think and to argue and so forth. Where else on the planet can we do this? So in the spirit of scholarly exchange and civil debate, I wish to introduce a topic today that is sort of bound to drive discussion, hopefully, that hopefully will be beneficial. And what I want to cover today is the role of ideology in the study of crime, particularly. And I think that we can see today that ideology is playing itself out in a lot of different stages. My interest in this, I didn't come to it, it came to me. So when I started working in the bio area, everyone said, John, don't do it. Okay, there was nothing really being written outside of perhaps Tony Walsh, Lee Ellis, in crime. The area had laid dormant for many, many years, decades, right? And there was a lot of fear amongst my friends and colleagues of, if you do this, all of these things will happen to you. And you know what? They were right. They all did, right? And to some of it is to be expected, and this is certainly not anything, how can I say, every area has its complaints, right? If you work in policing, it's hard to get a policing article published in certain journals. If you work in, corrections, you have to go to certain journals. So I certainly understand that. But bio's been a bit different. And I became, first, to be honest with you, the reviews that contain just venomous personal attacks. You have to be a racist to write this. You're re-invoking eugenics arguments. It was almost like the same person writing the reviews over and over again. And at first, honestly, you get called names that much, you get a little bit angry, right? Then I thought to myself, why? Why do people have such strong beliefs about certain topics? Why do they not have strong beliefs about other topics? Why do they really dedicate themselves to running with a narrative that may or may not be fully vetted, okay? And that's really what got me into it. After many years of just being angry, I thought, I should study this. I should try to analyze it. I should try to think about it as a scholar instead of, seeing it as something that's personal. Because I don't think it was really personal. Bio hits certain areas that I'll talk about here. The question goes to, why do scientists, right, scholars, people with advanced degrees, hold certain views? Some of these views, even arguably not backed by science. Well, part of this is because we're all human. Part of this is because we all have our preferences. Part of this is because we were born in a certain time, we came from a certain place, we have different experiences, right? That's part of it. Part of it, too, is a little bit more complicated, and I want to explain some of that with some of the other research later. We can see ideological division today in our society. In fact, in many ways, it's really splitting our society apart. Look at the current presidential election, not from a position of one camp or the other, but from the rhetoric that comes out of both camps. And look at the partisanship. And these are Pew data that show the difference in the ideological divide from 2004 to 2014. And you can see this split between Republicans and Democrats has grown wider and wider. Now, If you're a Democrat, you blame the Republicans. If you're a Republican, you blame the Democrat. Everyone stands, they point at each finger. But let me suggest another possible alternative. And that is each party is doing what the science tells them to do. They're highlighting certain issues that motivate people in that party to go out and vote, to donate money. And this is what Dan Kahan, who's a lawyer, a cognitive specialist in Yale, calls fact politicization. That certain facts, okay, become attached to certain ideologies. Therefore, when they're attached to a certain ideology, the people that buy into that, are in that camp, buy into the fact that they really don't depart from it. And we've seen this with things like climate change and gun control and just a host of other issues where strong feelings emerge, and then one camp claims the issue and the other camp claims another issue. And each camp telling the other how wrong they are. The ideological divide affects campuses. Depending on the campus you're on, it may be more or less. But we have clearly seen, I think, over the last couple years, specifically, the role of ideology and belief and strong partisanship sometimes on campuses. We've had all sorts of interesting things happen just in the past year on many campuses nationwide. Some of them quite scary in terms of freedom of speech and thought and liberty, things that should matter to all of us, even if we disagree with each other. So part of this is built into what ideology is. Now, when I don't use ideology in terms of a pejorative label, right? You're ideological, I'm not. No, ideology is a little bit more than that. It's a lot more than that, actually. And this comes from an article by Walter Miller, criminologist, published in 1973. And you can see here that Miller, right, has talked about the very same things we see today. Again, the 60s and 70s were pretty tumultuous on campus and in society. And we're seeing these themes echoed again in many different ways. What's interesting here is that that partisan polarization, if I can find this here, partisan polarization is stronger than measures of racial bias. That you're more likely to hold affirmative beliefs about other groups different from different races than you are about people opposite your political viewpoints. So that's pretty interesting ways that we see the world sort of fundamentally in some ways. But you can see here, Miller told us, it'll transform plausibility into ironclad certainty. Strong beliefs condition, right, conviction. Reasoned advocates become implacable zealots. Right, tell me we haven't seen that on campus, and tell me we don't see that in our national political dialogue today. The general consequences, according to Miller, were fairly straightforward. We see this played out as well. We see strong polarization, right? The fact that we can now separate people into groups based upon liberal or conservative or Democrat or Republican, right? And that these groups are rather homogenous, remarkably homogenous now, sets the conditions for the belief that certain ideas are also dangerous. Certain ideas get labeled immoral. If you're a person on the right, Republican, strong sort of capitalist and everything, the idea that we have a socialist running for president, right, you pull your hair out. Why? Because it's so counter to their logical narratives. On the other hand, Donald Trump. You see, that's all I have to say. So we see this. What I also find interesting almost is the reverse projection, right? And this is very interesting because I find it in the data that I collect. I'll show you later. And that is, if I'm in this camp, right, if I'm liberal and I think that you're not as liberal, then you're not. Then you're seen as conservative. So it's an amplification of the difference between people within the same ideological camps. You see it with Republicans, you're not conservative enough. You see it with liberals, you're not liberal enough. And typically that means that there's a variance in opinion. Okay? So Walter Miller laid this out in many different ways. Targets of ideological condemnation, right? Distortion of opposition. So I want to pull this out and say this is actually, the study of this actually started in probably the 60s and 70s, if not before, with some of the major studies of faculty that occurred, I think, 40s and 50s also. But that we see this play itself out actually when we start looking in criminology and in the study of crime. I'll show you that in a minute. But ideology, I like Jost et al.'s explanation the best. Crystallize and communicate widely shared beliefs, opinions, and values of an identified group. Okay? They endeavor to describe and interpret the world as it is through assumptions and assertions of human nature and history. They envision the world as it should be, specifying acceptable means. Okay? That's not Republican or Democrat, right? These are fundamental sets of assumptions about what's right, what's wrong, what we should do, what we shouldn't do, and how we should do it. The important part about all of these definitions is that they're not solely individual based. It's the identification with a known group. So that when we talk about a professional personal ideology, it's in reference to the group that we belong to or in the group that we're opposed to. But it is the attachment of the group that matters. In this way, ideology or the study of ideology is very much a social or a sociological type of process. There we go, right? Describe and interpret, I sort of break this down. What he also talks about, this is from Dan Cahan as well, elective affinity, the creation of homophily in belief and motive. Okay? If you're on the far left, you have certain beliefs that you share with people on the far left. Okay? Capital punishment, gun control, XYZ, you can literally name them. If you're on the far right, you have certain beliefs that you share with people on the far right. Pretty simple to understand, and actually the data are very clear on this. Political science has done a remarkably good job at measuring these attitudes and predicting these attitudes, and they can tell you actually down to the block level, right? Voting patterns and voting differences to the level of, the street. Excuse me. So, what's the purpose in it? Well, Cahan outlines the motive, right? Relationships. We want affiliations with others who share our cognitive realities. We like to be around others like ourselves. We've studied this in criminology all the time with delinquent peers, right? And every other group. We seek out groups of people who share our values. If you're a strong gun rights person, you seek out people that support that viewpoint, and you don't seek out people that don't. You join the NRA, you don't join the gun control groups. Just the opposite if you're pro-gun control. You're seeking out homogeneity in your network. And homogeneity in networks by politics is stronger than IQ, and is stronger than personality. You're more likely to marry somebody, for example, who shares your political ideology than you are to marry someone that shares your religion. Epistemic. Ideologies reduce uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity into simple narratives. You have all of these flags. I love them, right? Don't tread on me, right? That's a viewpoint, strong viewpoint, right? I love it. Don't mess with me. Okay, this is Texas. Kick your ass, right? Twice. I mean, there's something. I appreciate it. It's not, please don't tread on me, right? It's not, it's okay if you tread on me a little bit. He's like, don't even. And the flags around, liberty, right? There's one out there that says liberty or death, right? These are positional viewpoints that are pretty straightforward, pretty strong, right? I'm very much attracted to what they're reducing uncertainty. They're statements that reduce uncertainty down to something very narrow. And that's what the narratives do for us. They're heuristics, cognitive heuristics, that allow us to sort of stop thinking, stop scrutinizing, and start just believing and accepting. And then search for meaning, self-esteem, cognitive safety. This is the one thing that I'll show you later that can be deeply problematic inside an academic circle. Cognitive safety. Okay? People feel free to express divergent opinions in relatively homogeneous groups. After all, think of our jobs as scholars. To speak the truth. As I told some of your graduate students, that's really hard to do. It is. Right? Get up in front of an audience and disagree. There's a price to be paid for that sometimes. There's a price to go against the grain. All of the incentives are to go with the grain. So cognitive safety actually becomes something very utilitarian. I want to protect my career. I want to get a job. I want to get tenure. I want to get promotion. Those types of calculations are perfectly legitimate and real. But the fact that you have to make them suggests that there's a cost to be paid, right, for holding views that may be counter to the views held by a group. And that's not just an academic, by the way. I spent 10 years in the military, okay, where there's a definite hierarchy and rank structure. You know, having divergent opinions sometimes is not the way to career promotion. It's true in business. There's a lot of work in business about work groups and business work groups. What happens when they all start thinking the same? Right? They profit, they make bad decisions, they do things that are wrong, right? Criminal. What happened? So what's the contemporary research on this? Well, there's a lot of it actually. And when I started looking, I was actually quite amazed at how much there was and what political science, political sociology, psychology, neurology has to tell us about this. Political ideology, for example, we mostly think is something that we acquire through socialization. But about 60% of you don't hold views or vote the way your parents do. I certainly don't. Different, okay? Twin studies, the heritability studies, find that political ideology, this is across several samples now, it's about 0.4, okay? It's about 40% of the variation in differences in political ideology driven by something that goes into that G category. There are brain imaging studies now that are very interesting. A couple books out, what they call the blue brain and the red brain. Interesting read, but the point is that the imaging studies, when presented with images, for example, of people in harm, people in pain, or disgusting types of things, conservatives react more strongly than do liberals. Right? When presented with pictures of nurturance, group cohesion, liberals react more strongly than conservatives. And images of, as you might imagine, right, things that anti-religious, right? Conservatives react more strongly. The disgust response is actually measurable neurologically. It's also measured physiologically. So the emotional side of this, and it is a very strong emotional element, is that it's not just an idea that people have, or a set of ideas that people have. It's the emotional values of those ideas. they attach strong views, strong emotions to certain views and not to others. But it's not just certain views. What we generally get are all the above. Okay? What the political sociology shows is that we get bundles of beliefs. So if you're anti-capital punishment, right, very legitimate position to hold, you're also typically anti-gun control, pro-abortion rights, and the list goes on, right? And we can do the same thing for people on the right. So it's if you buy into one, generally, you buy into all the above. Even though they're not necessarily logically connected, or even necessarily logical, right? There's no reason, if you're pro-capital punishment, that you're also pro-gun control. There's not anything necessarily unifying about this necessarily. But the emotions that people attach to that go into how we cognitively process these things. And they also create very, very strong perceptions of in-group and out-group hostility. We love people like ourselves. We do, okay? And if you think about it, you're an academic, you're gonna have an academic life, right? You're gonna surround yourself probably with a lot of other academics. Not mentally healthy, all right? And one of the things I recommend to students is have friends outside of academia. You know, they help keep you grounded and all of that stuff. But we go a long way to circumscribe our experiences and to isolate ourselves from people that we disagree with. It's very easy thus to look at people who disagree, or people at another party, or people with another perspective as there's something wrong with them. I don't understand how they think that way. What you have to understand is they feel the same way about you, right? And as scholars, right, we do the same thing, right? We're people, but as scholars, we're supposed to be able to explain both sides, be able to weigh how one group sees it as opposed to how another group sees it. Well, this is quite a challenge when we're part of those groups. The other thing is, excuse me, political ideology, once embraced, is very difficult to change. Once you're far left, you're far left. Once you're far right, you're far right. People move a little bit. Some people make dramatic changes, but they're in the minority. How does it affect us cognitively? It's not just that you belong to a good group and everyone else is in the bad group, right? It affects us through a process called motivated reasoning. Motivated reasoning is pretty simple to understand, but has real consequences for us as scholars, for us as researchers. Motivated reasoning essentially says we actually start with the answer, and then we work backwards, and we look for evidence that confirms our views. Right? I mean, what are you taught in methods? You start with a hypothesis, and then we go here, and then we go there, and then we get the answer. In reality, most people engage in motivated reasoning, heuristics, cognitive shortcuts that says, you know, I believe this, that's where I'm starting. And then they work backwards, whether with a data set or through literature or what have you, to verify their viewpoints. They acquire information differentially. Information that they agree with, gets accepted more readily. This is empirically shown. It's also experimentally shown. Okay? Information they disagree with gets hyper-scrutinized or just rejected. Very human process, okay? Motivated reasoning, when we encounter those views, right, those things that make us uncomfortable. How many of you have ever read an article, right, in a magazine or even in a journal, and you're just like, oh, you know, you have this like visceral emotional reaction. How could they say that, you know? There you go, right? It's a very human response. It's cognitive, but it's also emotional. Some of it is conscious, some of it's not. Okay? And when we hit these points, when we hit those papers, right, and those arguments, a couple things can happen to us. One, right, we just reject it, okay? I'm not even gonna listen, shut it down, done, okay? Very normal. Second, we actually feel it, right? We go through a stress response. Pupils dilate, we have muscle oxygenation, all of the autonomic nervous system reactions that you have when you're threatened. Same thing, right? Or thirdly, and there's a great study on this, we expend cognitive effort to prove them wrong, even if it means we get the wrong answer. And I'll show you what I mean by that here shortly. So this process, motivated reasoning, informs a lot of research that's being done in psychology, cognitive psychology, political psychology, and has direct bearing on us. It's engaged in across the political spectrum. Everybody, right? But really engaged in people with higher levels of education and higher levels of IQ. Education and intelligence do not exempt people from motivated reasoning, they refine it. People with higher levels of intelligence come up with more reasons why they're right. And they come up with more reasons why other people are wrong, rather than people in the middle or at the lower end of the spectrum. And think about that, okay? Excuse me. Associated with higher levels of political partisanship. The people that are most active politically, right, most motivated politically, are the most partisan. Remember I said that the parties are doing exactly what the science tells them to do? Man, think about that. If you're a marketing person and you want someone to buy your product, right, they've got it down. They know exactly what to do to get you motivated. So motivated that you'll form a group, you'll write letters, you'll put a bumper sticker on that $80,000 car, you'll put signs up, you'll donate money, all sorts of things. That's a hell of a marketing campaign, in a lot of ways. It's all practical psychology. So remember I said that this is engaged in by people with higher levels of IQ. Is more refined. This is an experimental study from Kahan and the Cultural Research Project out in Yale. And it's really interesting because he was looking at numeracy, right, math ability. And they gave people under experimental conditions math-based questions about the efficacy of a treatment. And literally it's crosstabs. And all they had to do is calculate relative risks. Of course, people that are good at math, right, can do this better than people that are not good at math. Their data clearly show that, right? In neutral things, when they were asked, for example, do skin cream, right? Did the skin cream make the rash go away or not, right? People, liberal and conservative, found the same answer. Didn't matter. But when they experimentally manipulated the condition and asked about gun control, and phrased it so that liberals got got two possible outcomes: gun control, increase crime, or gun control, reduce crime, right? And they did the same thing to conservatives. All of a sudden, their quantitative advantage of both groups, right, dwindled, and all of a sudden they got the wrong answer. So liberals who got the scenario there about gun control increasing crime were more likely to get the wrong answer, even though they scored higher in measures of quantitative ability. Conservatives, the same thing. And Kahan thinks that's pretty good evidence. I don't see anything necessarily to refute it, that people are engaging in motivated reasoning when confronted with issues that contravene their political positions. I'll be honest, I've done the same thing. I've read a paper And what the hell can you know? And as a reviewer, I let that influence how I evaluated that paper. There's no way to get around it other than to become aware of it, right? And, well, let me go on, I'll explain this. Motivated reasoning is not irrational. In fact, it's very rational, okay? And it's rational because of this. All groups demand conformity. All groups demand some type of ideological allegiance. So there's a real cost to be paid, okay? I mentioned that earlier in academia, okay? Anytime you hear someone say, I would never publish in that area, they're recognizing an implicit cost, right? That could be occurred if they engage in certain types of research. Anytime you hear someone say, I would never teach that stuff, right? They're recognizing a potential, real or not, cost of working in that area. Most of the time it's somewhat real. This can occur in graduate school, of course, not being mentored, not getting a job later on, right? Not getting published, not getting tenure, not getting promoted. Just one anecdote, we had a student that went on an interview, tells you how people process things sometimes, and his talk was on something about, they had a prison sample, and he didn't get hired because he didn't bring up mass incarceration and all of this other stuff. So they deduced from that, the fact that he didn't bring up those issues, that he was not liberal enough. And the hiring committee said, they called back to a friend and said, yeah, that's what happened. I'm like, are you kidding? Do you know this guy? So it's that relative, it's emphasis between relative positions in the same group that can sometimes get you. But again, motivated reasoning, right? Left and right. And this is really what helped me, I think, grasp why people were so opposed and are still so opposed to work in the biosocial area and others. Let me say that. It's not just biosocial. It's pretty much anything dealing with individual differences. Okay? Jonathan Haidt, if you've ever read his book, it's a fantastic book. They have data from, oh my goodness, all sorts of people, thousands and thousands and thousands. They've developed this moral questionnaire. Haidt started out as a moral philosophy, if you will, and his work has evolved since. He's given several TED Talks, if you're interested. Pretty interesting guy, writes fairly well. What Haidt argues is essentially that liberals and conservatives are not necessarily defined by the issues as much as what they prioritize and how they feel and what the processes that they think about. So he developed what he called the harm and care part of the moral foundations, and then the fairness reciprocity. They looked at the difference between liberal, conservative, and the whole dimension there, and essentially what they find is that liberals tend to emphasize the harm on things, or the perceived harm of things, right? That there's a caring, a nurturance, a desire not to see people suffer, not to see people, even as through their own decisions, not have to face all of those potentially negative consequences. The other thing they find is that in terms of fairness, people on the left equate fairness with equality, okay? People on the right equate fairness with process. They both value fairness, but they value it differently, okay? Those are individualizing foundations, what Haidt calls them. The binding foundations, right? When we start to process information this way, in-group, out-group loyalty, authority or respect for authority, and what he called the purity sanctity models, okay? And these are what bind us together. Respect for the group, right? You're loyal to the group. Excuse me. You respect hierarchy. You respect your professor, right? Hierarchy. Person in charge, what have you. And then, of course, the sanctity stuff on moral disgust and spiritual concerns, right? What does this mean for you morally? What's this action mean for you as a person, as a human being? Now, what's really interesting about a lot of the research is that both, everyone engages in this and prioritizes this, but liberals generally draw on the first two principles, while conservatives tend to draw on all of them across the board, not necessarily elevating one over the other, right? And how many times have you heard conservatives hate, they don't care about people, right? And some of you are going, yeah, that's true, right? And on the other side of that, how many times have you heard, liberals, they just see everything in terms of whether it's fair, right? Well, life ain't fair. Well, that's true too. But this is part of where it's coming to and part of what's going. This is problematic for both sides and even for ourselves in our own lives. Why? Because we become very intolerant of people who think differently. We become very intolerant of other groups. We engage in all sorts of stereotyping, some of it accurately, some of it not. We emphasize difference instead of seeing similarity. Okay? Excuse me. Okay, I don't know what. Let's try it. Hate also argues that when people associate, right, collectively along these lines, they form what's called a tribal moral community. I love the term. Tribal in the sense that it's evolutionary, right? There's safety in numbers, safety in similarity, safety in having people around you that are the same. It's moral in the sense that they're defining issues and thought processes and facts in moral and emotional terms. Back to the fact politicization, if you will. Excuse me. The shared beliefs bind and blind. They bind people together in informal networks, right? But they blind people to their biases. They blind people to their discriminatory practices or the weaknesses in their own arguments. Pretty interesting. Haidt goes on to tell us, right, that in academia, predominantly a left-of-center organization, institution, that they have what's called sacralized or made sacred gender, race, intelligence, and biology. And that when you touch those, right, you're not just touching something that is empirical, subject to scrutiny, subject to scientific evidence. You're touching something that people see as sacred, as moral, as intrinsically meaningful. Hence the relatively bad reactions that academia has generated towards research on intelligence, race, sex differences, right? The list goes on. So after reading Haidt and after reading all of that, I'm like, I wonder if this is true for us, okay? Well, if we see loyalty, right, to a group as almost contrary to what it means to be an academic, right, then maybe we have to think about that. This is just one example, right? Out-group beliefs are viewed as apostasy. This is literally taken from Miller, I think. And when someone violates these core sacralized beliefs, right, they're treated as apostates. That they violated something sacred. I put this up here as an illustration, not because it's of its empirical merits, but how many editorials did we see, right, coming out of the riots and social unrest of the last few years that were factually incorrect, bombastic, ideologically loaded, okay? How many criminologists wrote contrary articles? How many criminologists wrote an editorial back and said the Black Lives Matters argument on police brutality is numerically inconsistent? Wrong. Yeah, that's what I heard, right? But we did have people write editorials in favor of it, right? We did have people go out and join the groups and so forth, which, again, free to do. But here we have a single article published, an editorial, by the way, published in the Wall Street Journal by Heather McDonald, right? And this thing had been subject to immediate and immense criminological scrutiny, as it should be. Okay? In fact, there was a very good article just published on this issue, but we had several criminological repudiations, and we had the ASC Policy Committee send out a letter to everyone in the ASC, right, asking for their help in debunking the Ferguson effect. Now, no problem, right? As scholars, we should be able to question anything. The question is, are we willing to question anything? So are professors at TMC? Well, maybe. There's a statistically impossible degree of intellectual homogeneity amongst our ranks. In sociology, it's liberal and conservatives 20 to 40 to 1. There are 13,000 sociologists in the United States. No more than 600 are center or right of center. Most of those people work in the government. Anthropology, 20 to 1. Criminology on prior estimates, somewhere between 10 to 1. The data are not clear on this. Economics, 3 to 1. Business, 1.5. Engineering, medicine, 1 to 1. There's a series of studies looking at these differences, both from voting records, donation records, self-reported political affiliations, things like this, okay? Now, one level, that's not a problem. It's not a problem if people are liberal or very liberal at all. Not a problem if people are conservative, very conservative. It's only a problem if our ideologies or our group loyalty is affecting how we see the world and affecting our policy choices and affecting the things that we study and affecting the things that we don't study. Okay? So, excuse me, and study several, but a few that are out there, humanities and the social sciences faculty. There's almost no disagreement on gun control, support for the minimum wage, environmental regulation, capitalism, or discrimination narratives. Virtually none. This is quite different from what we see in surveys of the general population, where there's fairly substantial differences. There are almost no conservatives on most campuses. There are virtually none left in the humanities and none in the social sciences. Virtually none. This is only consequential if ideology, again, is tied to perception and production of knowledge. I'm sure we would find some type of overrepresentation in other areas. You're more likely to find conservatives, for example, in certain businesses, but not all, probably in the military. It depends, right? This is a political orientation of one study of 1,600 faculty by Gross and Levitt. And again, you can see that there's a fairly large proportion here. What was interesting about the Gross and Levitt study is that those in the middle of the road, about 90% of them scored liberal. So they called themselves moderates, but all of their voting, donations, and policy support were to the left. Very sort of interesting. Average ratio of Democrat to Republican from Klein, Gross and Levitt, and several other people, 16 to 1. Social sciences, broad group. Humanities, you can see we go lower and lower there. Percentage radical, activists, Marxists, because you have to remember in academia, it's not just are you very conservative to very liberal. We've got that extra group, the radical, right, Marxist orientation, that I'm also very familiar with, by the way, okay? So, it goes even further in that direction. This is from, I believe it was Tony Walsh and Ellis and John Cooper. It's a small-scale study of CJ faculty, crim faculty. I think they took it from an ASC meeting. But you can see the differences here. It's about 14 to 1, liberal to conservative. Again, Cooper data, he broke it down by where they got their degree, whether it was in sociology, criminology, or criminal justice. You can see again how these things literally break down. Sociology, very, very left of center type of discipline. You have radical, you have liberal, you have some moderates. There's no one in that category. And then you can see here in terms of, this is people with criminology degrees from dedicated crim programs, and then people from CJ degrees. So you can start to see the outline here that where you get your degree, or the program type of program you get your degree in, says something about your political affiliation, okay? Again, going back to Miller, I thought this was instructive. The ideological environment of the average academic criminologist is highly artificial, reflects perspectives of a deviant, I love the term, an unrepresentative minority, okay? I've always said that I'm quite deviant, and I'm pretty good, feeling fine with minority status, intellectual minority status, but it's something, again, to look at. We are pulled from two sides of a distribution. Intellectually, we're pulled from the right side, okay? Studies estimate IQ by profession. Most college professors in the social sciences are about 110, 115 on an IQ distribution and higher, right? And when I say that, everyone goes, yeah, we're smart, right? And then when I turn around and I say, but you're pulled from less than 2% of the distribution of political ideology, they're like, oh, that's not a problem, right? We do not represent, at least politically or even intellectually, the rest of the United States. We're very different in that sense. Okay, so to get into the data, what I want to show you is I thought, right, there's all this stuff that makes suggestions, and we can test some of these hypotheses. I had this idea years ago. I had the way the Trayvon Martin shooting happened, and then some other social events happened, the riots. I mean, I did not want the data polluted by those, wide-scale events. I didn't want to pollute by those wide-scale events. So, I waited and waited and waited. It took forever. But it gave us time to redo some of the survey questions. It was collected via the internet. We got about almost 1,000, about 900, around 990, I think. Includes graduate students, so we can eventually compare graduate students in the pipeline to faculty. We have a 660, 670 active faculty. We have retired faculty. We have adjuncts. We have people across the distribution in criminology. Okay, no other study to date of criminology has been this large, and none have been have captured such a wide range of people practicing the discipline. Okay. At the same time, I'm like publicly shame UC's IRB. It took a freaking year to approve this study with comments like, you should change this word from it to this, or what have you. Perfect illustration of a good idea converted to a bad one. Nonetheless, the master scale of biases. This comes from original study, I'm going to mispronounce the name, Gunnar Myrdal. Actually, I think he was a Norwegian scholar working in the United States, worked in one of the top faculty in the United States. He was studying race, right? In the late 1930s and 40s, wrote this wonderfully complex book. And in the back of the book, there's an appendix number 2 about, right, biases in the social sciences and difficulties studying, right, race and other types of issues. Quite remarkable. And he calls, right, this the master scale of biases in the social sciences, the standard left-right scale, which comes from France when they split their Congress into the left and right, okay? So the degree to which a scientist is prepared to study unpopular stuff, right, and state plainly and clearly unpopular conclusions, he wrote, depends on political inclinations, his personal courage, and relative freedom. Now, let me advance an idea to you, that to talk about controversial ideas as an academic shouldn't require courage. The freedom to discuss controversial ideas should be open. We should be able to talk freely about any idea, examine it on its merits, Courage should not be one of the ingredients. That's my own little personal take on that. So, the left view, right, on this, and this is coming from the work of John Haidt, by the way, is that there are possible consequences, and that is certain liberal views become accepted as science, okay? That values and assumptions become embedded in theories. I think that's pretty clear in some of the theories that we have. Negative attitudes regarding conservatives become part of the criminological narrative. Disciplinary rewards favor in-group loyalty and incentivize certain types of thinking, right? So the last one, the echo chamber, the bubble, right? A lot of interesting psychological work on what happens when people don't have any variation in their ideological networks. You know, the longest story is they believe their own bullshit. No one's there to check their reality. Happens to all of us, okay? And it breeds extremist types of views. So we can look at this. We have measures of ideological overrepresentation. We have self-reported measures on the left-right distribution, positional measures, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican. I have voting, radicalism. So we have multiple ways of measuring that. We have some of the consequences over here in terms of negative trait ascriptions. It was very liberal. We expect very negative trait ascriptions towards conservatives, ideological roles, self-censorship, back to that freedom issue, perceptions of academic freedom and bias, and then finally, impact of ideology on support for public policy, science views, and criminal justice policy. I have a lot of other data that I'm not presenting. I'm probably presenting too much, but I like data. So political self-classification, and this is a cross level of group here. And this other group, it contains graduate students, postdocs, folks like that, okay? But you can see a fairly high level, right? We're all above 80% self-identified feminist. That's even true amongst people classified themselves as conservative. Most conservatives also identify themselves as feminist. Pretty interesting. Radicals, right? Liberal, conservative. Well, there's your first, right, difference. Here we have Democrat, people that vote Democrat, people that vote Republican. I have more detailed questions about their willingness to vote. I'll show you in a second. But notice this category. This is a dynamic that everyone else finds too, and that is if I asked, someone on, if I asked Frank Collin, who's really, pretty much to the left, right? Are you really leftist? He'd go, I'm pretty moderate. If I asked someone else, I'd have to think of someone on the right, right? Oh, I'm pretty moderate, okay? We typically think of our views as moderate, even though we never vote moderate, right? And our policy views are not moderate, they're not neutral. So self-identified political status, emeritus faculty, you can see there are no conservatives, full faculty, associate, assistant, right? The other group, and people that work in the government like BJS and places like that. So we're broken down. It looks a little bit like this. We're over 80% on this side, about 12% on this side. But when I go back, right, and I look at that 12%, which was 92 people, 2/3 of them are actual moderates. 1/3 are actually conservative. So the number of conservatives in the field, true consistent conservatives in the field, are about 30, 32 out of a sample of almost 1,000. Again, these are partisan voting differences. And you can see here, strong tilt in one direction and an anti-bias in the other. The distribution of what you might call radical beliefs in the field. 77% of those who are self-classified as very liberal are also self-classified as Marxist in their orientation. The people, again, this 12% of the conservatives, when I take out the moderates, there are no conservatives that say I'm radical Marxist, okay? This is what it looks like in criminology. The best estimate of the overrepresentation of liberal to conservative is about 30-1. Okay? And that places us right there with anthropology, cultural anthropology, and sociology. Perhaps shouldn't be surprising since we came from, criminology essentially migrated out of sociology in some ways. Point I'd like to make here is that there's comparatively greater political difference found in most other types of organizations. I found one study on NRA members, and there was greater political difference within the NRA than there is within criminology. We see this also with religious organizations and certain churches. What are the consequences? Remember I said that those negative trait ascriptions, right? If we're really partisan, we don't like the other group, okay? There's no real finesse about it, or we just don't like you. I've placed these up here because they all share a common narrative. And that narrative relates to incarceration and what people call mass incarceration. That is, conservatives were responsible for mass incarceration, and they were bad, and they did so for reasons of racial hostility. Forget that the crime rate increased sevenfold. Forget that it increased monotonically from 1920 to 1970, 75, right? It was completely racial animus in the Get Tough movement. And only conservatives, of course, would argue those stupid points, even though liberals and conservatives both passed the legislation to put 500,000 more cops on the street, increase sentence lengths, that blue states and red states increased sentence penalties. Right? Somehow that gets overlooked. Not to say that there are not very good merits to both of these examples, but look at the trait description data. We ask people, do you consider this more conservative or more liberal? Authoritarian. Conservatives are authoritarians, right? That's essentially what that says. The people in the sample, when they see conservative, they equate it to being authoritarian. They equate it to being religious. They equate it to being racist, sexist, and wealthy. Pretty much mirrors the national dialogue, doesn't it? On the other hand, folks certainly are very happy to see liberals as charitable, community-minded, compassionate, educated, intelligent, objective, and scientific. This is probably what you would expect from in-group, out-group types of analyses. If I were to ask a bunch of conservatives, right, I would get a pattern just the opposite. The roles of ideology, faculty roles. We have advanced the cause of social justice, and you can see through here, ideology correlates with each one. Ideology from very liberal to very conservative. That's the direction of the correlation. There was substantial agreement with advanced causes of social justice and advocacy positions. Okay. And you can see down through here, challenge the status quo, teach respect for authority, law and order, much less support in that direction. These represent the differences between those collected viewpoints. And what you have to also keep in mind is that while this looks like it's really large, there are relatively few people in those categories. I kept the moderates in with the conservatives just to have enough for comparative purposes. So we have about 90 people in these two categories. We have 700, 800 in these. Okay. In terms of predicting faculty roles, political ideology was the strongest. If you're left, the further left you are, the stronger you believe in teaching about white privilege and social justice and that stuff. The further right you were, the less likely you were to agree. Self-censorship, this is actually, I think, kind of scary. How willing would you be to write an article that could be misinterpreted to support some of the isms? 50% of criminologists agreed. You have to sort of presuppose whether an article could support, right, one of the isms. So if you're talking about group differences or sex differences, would that support sexism or racism, right? But 50% is a remarkably high level, I think, of self-censorship. And it's not all that well correlated with political ideology. The people most likely to report the highest levels of self-censorship are actually very liberal. Justify harsher sanctions, right? You can see 74% said yes, 26% harm reputation of colleagues, and you can reflect, you can see the rest of it through here. The correlations, these correlations were bundled like everything else, so that what it really showed, if I showed you the full matrix, was that people are afraid, if afraid is the right term, that their colleagues would interpret it as sexist or racist, or see the punishment of harsher of offenders, that the penalty would be paid there. It's not whether it would be paid outside. And of course, predicting self-censorship, the people in the moderate conservative group are less likely to engage in self-censorship along these dimensions, as are people that publish quite a bit. Perceptions of academic freedom. Ever avoided teaching a controversial subject? 13% said yes. Ever avoided researching? 10% said yes. But what's really interesting is that it wasn't them, it was everyone else, right? Do you know colleagues, right, who have not taught subjects or not researched subjects or things like this? And part of this could be a numeric imbalance. There's only one respondent, but they know a lot of people in a network. Again, 47% say their colleagues have avoided teaching or research topics. They feel like they can conduct research on any topic without fear, right? 33% of the sample said no, they could not. So it's not a false assumption to believe that, at least people believe in the discipline, that there are potential penalties attached with these. My department fully supports academic freedom. About 40%, somewhat or no. Let me advance this a little bit. Perceptions of bias in academia, 70% of the sample agreed that there's a liberal bias. Unlike other studies we asked about other biases, there's a conservative bias. You see 15% agreed. They were all very liberal. Universities too influenced by business. This cut across political ideology, actually. And then in terms of the negativities, 27, 28% feel like teaching and research is negatively affected. My department would discriminate against conservative job applicant, 23% agreed. I have other measures of discrimination. When I tally them up, it's ranged 35 to 40% agreement. And yet, we see fairly high levels of the criminologists are fair and impartial. So there's agreement that there would be discrimination. There's agreement that there's some negative consequences with overrepresentation and potential biases, but we're okay. It's kind of an inconsistency, I think. Nonetheless, you can again see that political ideology strongly predicts perception of consequence, whether liberal or conservative. This is the really core matter. This is support for public policy, support on beliefs on science, certain science issues, and support for criminal justice policies. In a real world, right, where people would make a decision, right, that I don't support gun control, not because I believe in it, but because the evidence isn't there, right, that you would see differences across response patterns, right? In fact, I support this, but I don't support that, right? That's what we would expect from moderate people not ideologically motivated. What we see here in questions about public policy, right, 84% are affirmative action. You all want to smoke pot, right? I thought you'd like that one. 36% of criminologists want hard drugs legalized. Less support for the war on terror, virtually no support on drugs. Minimum wage, right? Obamacare, the unionization of graduate students. I was almost afraid to put that up there. I don't want any bad ideas percolating. Look at stop and frisk, right? 27% support. Kids treated as adults in the system, not supported. Funding bio-research I threw in there because of obvious reasons. 76% supported. Every single person that disagreed with that was very liberal. And what do we find? Really startling results in the sense that ideology doesn't simply predict support for these various public economic or public safety policies, is that it covers it, okay? What people typically do is they'll take support for affirmative action, they'll run a model, political ideology is an independent variable. We can do that, it's always the strongest predictor, right? What I also did is I reversed it and predicted self-reported political ideology of the scholar with their response patterns on these questions. I am able to almost perfectly tell you whether you're a liberal, very liberal, conservative, moderate, based upon your response patterns. That's how tightly connected they are. Okay? And here are the public safety questions, right? You see strong partisan differences. Economic policies, right? Very, very strong. I mean, it's almost like a one-to-one type of thing. Discriminant analysis, 93% of cases were correctly classified based upon the liberal conservative criteria. Almost all of the error was in that conservative category where the moderates were included. In the very liberal and liberal categories, there was virtually no variation, none. Ask a series of questions about science. Evidence supports Darwinian evolution. Sex differences are caused primarily by biology, climate change. Some of these, I picked them out because they are partisan, okay? What's very interesting is the responses are partisan. So if most people said that genes influence criminal behavior, okay, but they went on and disagreed that genes influence anything else, except homosexuality. Very sort of, interesting political types of responses. You can see here, again, we can predict political ideology of a scholar almost perfectly from those questions. Non-whites and females show a particular pattern of what you might call hyperpartisanship, in the sense that those categories were predictive above and beyond their self-reported partisanship. Kind of an interesting dynamic there. I don't know what to make of it. But political ideology was the best predictor across all equations. We didn't do as good a job, 80% on the classification. But again, that conservative grouping is where all the variation was. And finally, in the issue of criminal justice policy, Frank Holland had surveyed ACGS members in 2003, 2004. So we replicated those measures. This gives us the ability to answer two questions, and that is, can we still predict, can we use ideology to predict the response patterns, and has there been a change from 2003 to 2015? Okay, make the long story short, factor analysis, we have three policy bundles. The first one's what I call the DNC bundle, because it represents the political platform of the DNC, anti-capital punishment, pro-gun control, racial profiling, criminal justice system discrimination. The second bundle was support for rehab, restorative justice, things like that. And the third was a sentencing bundle where all these questions about incarceration, 3 strikes, things like that fell into. So, excuse me, we again were able to classify 91% correctly, okay, based on these response bundles, and 97% of liberals were correctly classified. It's way above chance. Excuse me. And then, of course, you can see the differences here over time between our study here, 2015, 16, and Collins' original study. And just to move this forward here, what we find is that using a margin of error of about 4%, 5 of the 21 questions showed no statistical difference, although they all increased towards the left. The average difference between 2004 2015 was a 9% increase in tilt. That ranged from 0 to 21%. Major changes in support for the suspension of the death penalty, 16% increase abolishing 3 strikes, reducing support use of supermax prisons, 19% increase. And what's really interesting here, a much stronger belief that the system, the criminal justice system, is now more discriminatory than fair. The original ACJS survey that Colin did found that most criminologists said that the system was more fair than discriminatory. So this represents very much a difference in viewpoints over time. I think we should be careful about extending too much to that right now because of all of the things that have happened in the recent past. Some of that may have increased upwards that estimate. Nonetheless, these data are mirroring what have been found in other studies where we have seen a continual decline in conservatives, a continual decline in moderates who are faculty in the social sciences, and a substantial uptick in the number of people on the left who are working in the social sciences. That's probably affecting us as well, for good and bad. I think it is, just to conclude here, it's interesting that we place a lot of emphasis on diversity, right? We want people and difference because we think it makes us better. We think it makes the thinking process more open. We have people to debate with, but we really don't have a lot of diversity. In most departments, there's no one that's even moderate politically, or if they are, they're not saying so. People that are to the right generally will not say so. I've had a number of them call me, email me, thank you, on and on. If we respect diversity and diversity of views and argument and coming at things with data, right, then speaking to ourselves is not going to work. I think we're sometimes getting things right, we're also sometimes getting things wrong. And sometimes those things really do matter. In terms of public policy, our conversations with legislators, right, when we publish studies, they have consequences, certainly. Sometimes more than we anticipate, sometimes not at all. But it is very difficult for any of us, myself included, to be entirely objective. We have to send those types of arguments and analyses to people who pretty much kind of disagree with us. It's the only way, I think, to vet our work. I do not believe that we are going to change anytime soon. I don't think the field is all of a sudden going to attract a bunch of people on the right. I don't believe that people inside criminology are all of a sudden going to shift, right? I think the best approach is to not hide it, but to elevate it, bring it out, okay? It is quite okay to be on the left, it's quite okay to be on the right, but we should at least know that. So in certain disciplines now, or when you publish, you have to tell people, right, editors or reviewers, I belong to this group, okay? If you belong to a group, just like if you're in big pharma, right, which is connected to studies in pharmaceuticals that somehow find drugs work when they don't, then we need to take that into consideration. If I'm a member of the NRA doing gun control research, you might want to know that. If I'm a member of the NAACP doing race research, you might want to know that. It at least gives us some framework to evaluate and to become aware of potential biases and complications. Excuse me. I think at the other thing that might help, and this is also quite controversial, is, I think we just need journal reviews, anonymous reviews. That can be fine initially, but eventually I think everything should be public. If you want to see how something got published, what the reviews were, eventually that could be made available, right, and unblinded. That is holding people accountable. And the hard sciences, the New England Journal of Medicine and other places, they're now requiring pre-certification. Pre-certification says, we have this NIH grant or what have you, we're studying this, these are our hypotheses, these are our data, these are our strategies, trying to analyze it. They have to say that to the journal first, okay? What they have found is that the number of research hypotheses supported has dropped 70+%. I think we also have to get away from publishing statistically significant results at all costs, right? The null hypothesis should be valued. We should publish null results. It would be nice to see studies with null results, right? Dr. Zhao was talking at dinner last night about, I did this study, no difference, right? I did this study, no difference. That's probably more true than not true on a lot of things, right? At the university level, and I'll say this lastly, I'm a classical liberal. I believe strongly in free speech. I don't care who you are, what you say, you have a right to say it. I think we have to protect that environment. I think it is critically important for us as scholars to be able to communicate ideas, no matter how controversial, in a public sphere. The level of self-censorship in our sample is quite stark and problematic if you think about how much that could potentially bias the body of research that we produce. As universities become a little bit more politicized, there are greater and greater number of threats to open intellectual discourse. If we submit to those threats, if we enjoin those threats, we will no longer be able to talk to each other. How can we speak truth to power when we don't speak truth to each other? And I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much.